بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ومولاي يا رسول الله صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ومولاي وابن مولاي أبا عبد الله فاز من اعتصم بحبلكم وأمن من لجأ إلى حسنكم يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع لذنوبنا وتبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى محمد، والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله، بذكر الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. أما بعد، فقد قال الله عز وجل في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وإذا الموءودة سئلت بأي ذنب قتلت. آمنا بالله، صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Respected elders, scholars, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The ayah of the Holy Quran in Surah At-Takwir speaks about the relationship that the society in the time of Rasulullah had with their daughters, and how they used to, for example, bury their daughters alive. Now the ayah in particular, what it talks about are the events on the Day of Judgment, what will transpire. And Allah speaks in such a harsh language that He's talking about the Day of Judgment as if it's already happened. That on that day, these young daughters will be asked, for which sin were you killed? What crime did you commit? That you were taken, you were placed in the grave. Maw'udatun su'ilat. Mawdu'a from the word wa'ad, meaning that the soil was placed on them. And because the soil was heavy on them, it buried them. For which crime, for what did you do that your fathers buried you in this particular way? This discussion I want to expand on tonight. And I find it a pertinent discussion to speak about from a historical context. And the reason why is because when you look at the movement of Karbala, you realize that Karbala takes place 61 years after the demise of the Holy Prophet of Islam. 50 years, odd years after the demise of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Karbala takes place. Rasulullah engages in a revolution. In this revolution, he changes the whole perception of women and daughters. But then 50 years later, you realize that the whole movement of Karbala was carried by women. It was carried by the daughters of the Hashimiyya. Just 60 years before that, daughters were being buried alive. 60 years later, you find that the most important message in the religion of Islam, a message which seems as an archetype for all movements of justice against oppression, was carried by the daughters of Rasulullah. And so you realize what was Arabia before and how did the women carry the message of Karbala. What happened in these 60 years? That the most heaviest of responsibilities were placed on the shoulders of the women and not on the men. Yes, Imam Sajjad played a vital role carrying the message of Karbala, but he was helped by Zainab. He was helped by Kulthum salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhim ajma'een. So in terms of tonight's discussion, I want to break it up into three areas. Number one, for which reason were these daughters buried alive? And how did it start up? Number two, what effect did this have within that particular society? When you have a society that is burying daughters alive, how does that affect society? And number three, how did the daughters of the Bani Hashim carry the message of Karbala? So with regards to how this particular act started off, this particular tradition, it goes back to the time of a king by the name of Nu'man ibn al-Mundhir. Nu'man ibn al-Mundhir was one of the rulers of Iraq. He had a particular enemy in mind, a tribe, the Banu Tamim. The Banu Tamim were the tribes that lived in Arabia at that particular time, in Hijaz, Mecca, Medina, and of course the surrounding areas. Now, Nu'man ibn al-Mundhir, because the Banu Tamim were his enemies and he considered them as enemies, one day he launches an attack against the Bani Tamim. He enters their lands, they engage in a fight, he overpowers them, he is successful in his launching of attack, and he subdues them. When he subdues them, he takes his wives, he takes their wives and their children and their women as slaves, prisoners of war, and he takes them back towards the land of Iraq. Now the head of the Banu Tamim, Qais ibn Asim, he said, look, first of all, our women are taken as prisoners. Our women, they have nothing to do with this battle. Let's try and make an effort to go towards Nu'man ibn al-Mundhir and plead to him to return our women back to us. So they decide, they go towards the lands of Iraq, they meet or they have a meeting with Nu'man ibn al-Mundhir, and they plead to him. They recite verses of poetry. Of course, poetry in those days and in that particular time was seen as a form of entertainment. If you wanted a favor to be done, you would provide entertainment for that particular person. So they would recite verses of poetry. They made up with the king, and Qais ibn Asim, he said to the king, he said, look, our beef is between us. Our grudge is between us. Our women, let them come back home. Yes, our wives, our children, our daughters, let them all come back to us. The king replies to Qais. He says, look, I don't have an issue returning your women back to you, but there's only one issue. There's one problem. The problem is that our soldiers have married some of your women. Our soldiers have married some of your women. So unfortunately, they can't easily leave their new families and go back to your lands and return to your lands. But what I'll do is, I'll make an announcement. If they wish to stay in the lands of Iraq, let them stay in Iraq. If they wish to return to their lands in Hijaz, let them go back in the lands of Hijaz. So he makes a public statement. He says, all of you women who came as prisoners of war in this particular battle, you have two choices in your hands. Either you divorce your husbands and go back to your tribe where your fathers, your uncles, your brothers are waiting for you, or you disassociate yourselves from your tribes and you stay here in the lands of Iraq. So the first reason as to why this practice started was because of the fear of being subjugated by your enemy. The humiliation that follows from it was so severe that you found that the tribes in Arabia, they preferred to bury their daughters alive than rather one day fight an enemy, be subdued by them, and then have your women and your children taken as captives. So, anyways, the announcement is made. Qais ibn Asim, because he was the leader of the Bani Tamim, he then begins to narrate this. He says that when my daughter was asked about these two choices, she chose to remain in the lands of Iraq. Remember, you're talking about Qais ibn Asim, who is the leader of a tribe, a king of a tribe. She, her daughter, or his daughter, is seen as a princess. She preferred to stay in the lands of Iraq. She married one of the soldiers, and she saw that her life in Iraq was a life of respect. It was worse for her to go back to her town or to her city in Hijaz and to go back to her tribe than to stay in the lands of Iraq. So this particular action of his daughter, it was very heavy on his heart. And then he came to the conclusion saying that daughters have no loyalty whatsoever. And he was the first person who made a vow saying that, Wallah, if I have any daughters from this day onwards, I will bury each and every one of them. How many daughters did he have? He had 12 daughters, and he buried each and every single one of them after when his daughter broke all relationships from him, and chose to stay in the lands of Iraq. So many of these women that were taken as slaves, that were taken, for example, as captives and prisoners of war, chose to stay in the lands of Iraq rather than to come back in their own cities, in their own tribes. Typical Romeo-Juliet story, yes? The one tribe, for example, falls in love, one woman of a tribe falls in love with the enemy's tribe, one man from the enemy's tribe. And this was very much effective on Qais ibn Asim, and he makes this vow. They say that one day he lived long enough to meet the Holy Prophet of Islam. He meets the Prophet of Islam. He sits down with him. He says, I am Qais ibn Asim. I am the head of the Banu Tamim. And I to date have buried 12 daughters. And I had no remorse whatsoever doing so, because I realize that daughters have no loyalty whatsoever. Except in one case. In one case, I felt emotional when I was burying one of my daughters. So they asked him, the companions that were listening, they asked him, what was this story about? He says that one day I had to travel. So I traveled, I left my city. My wife was pregnant at the time. So I went on this travel. Unfortunately, my travel was prolonged. My wife gave birth, and then after she had given birth, I came back and I returned to my home. When I returned back, I asked my wife, what happened to the child? My wife responded saying that unfortunately she had gotten sick during the time of the delivery and she gave birth to a stillborn. So it died immediately when it came into this world. He said, I didn't think much of it. Life went on. Many years later, when I was sitting in my home, my wife walked into the living room with a young girl. He said to me, or she said to me, she said, Qais, this young girl is your daughter. Remember that day when you had to travel so many years ago? I gave birth to her, but I kept her hidden from you. She is your daughter. Asim, Ibn al-Asim, he narrates, he says, when I saw her face, I saw nothing but beauty. And I was affected by her beauty. And life went on. I let her live in this home. I let her live in this house. I looked after her some days, and so on and so forth. A few months passed by. They say that Asim's wife, Qais ibn Asim's wife, felt she had to leave the house, but she trusted her husband alone with his daughter. So she leaves the house. The daughter is alone with Qais. Qais, he says to his daughter, let's go play a game. Let's go play something. Let's go out the house. They leave the house. They go to a secluded area. And then he says to his daughter, now I want you to start digging with me. And they start digging, and she starts digging with him. All of a sudden, the hole is deep enough, and then he pushes her in. When she pushes her in, he begins to take the sand, and he begins to pour it on her. Maw'ud. Maw'udatun su'ilat. Yes? Wa'ad, the idea of throwing sand on these daughters. He begins to throw sand on top of her. She's crying, she's mourning, she's wailing. Baba, what are you doing? I don't like this game anymore. Baba, the sand is burying me. Baba, what do you intend to do? Go back to my mother without me? Baba, will you leave me here alone? All of a sudden he says, I carried on. Her words began to strike my heart, but I carried on. When I carried on, I buried her completely. They say Rasulullah is listening to these words, and tears are flowing from his eyes. When tears flowed from his eyes, he said, Wallah, such a man like this, his heart has hardened in such a way that Allah's mercy will never penetrate it. So you found that the first reason as to why the girls were buried alive in that particular tribe or in that particular time was because of the fear of being subjugated, that one day your enemy will overpower you and take your girls and your women as slaves. And God forbid, even more than that, that your women will fall in love with the other tribe, the tribe of your enemy. So this was the first reason. The second reason is beautifully seen in the story of Ammar ibn Yasir. They say one day Ammar ibn Yasir came home and he saw an idol on his shelf. Famous story we've all heard of before. He comes and he nudges the idol a little bit. The idol, whether it's accidental or deliberate, doesn't matter. The idol falls from the shelf. It breaks, it shatters. The noise They say Sumayya walks into the room, the mother of Ammar. Ammar, what have you done? You've broken God. Ammar says, mother, if this is God, then why did it not have the ability to protect itself? She says to him, Ammar, where is this rhetoric coming from? Where are these words coming from? Tell me. He replies, he says, my dear mother, these words are the words of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Now you have to understand one thing. What's beautiful about this story is how different we are as human beings. On the one hand, you'll find that there are people who come towards the religion of Islam because of the logic of the religion of Islam. Because Islam has logical perception, Islam has logical assumptions, and then you use this logic to accept the religion of Islam. Ammar ibn Yasir saw the logic of Tawheed, and that brought him towards the religion of Islam. Yes, he wasn't an academic where he nudges the idol. There's something logical. How can an idol protect itself if it's God, the Almighty? But his mother was different from what I understand. His mother didn't come to the religion of Islam because of logic and how logical Islam was, but rather because of an emotional reason, because of the principles of the religion of Islam. She says to him, Ya Ammar, tell me, what else has Rasulullah taught you? Ammar replies, today we spoke about burying of the daughters alive. How it is seen as a vile, despicable act which is haram in the religion of Islam. She begins to cry. She begins to fall in tears. Ammar's father, Yasir, approaches him. He says, Ammar, let me come and tell you something. Do you know why your mother is crying? He says, no. He says, your mother was the third daughter of your grandfather. Your grandfather had 2 daughters before he had your mother. When the first daughter was born, what did he do? He went in a secluded place, he dug, and he buried her alive. It was emotionally heavy for him. When he had a second daughter, he did the same thing. He went and he buried that daughter alive. And then after burying the second daughter, he made a vow. He said, Wallah, if I have a third daughter, I will not bury her alive, because of the emotional heaviness that went into his heart. He says, your mother was the third daughter of your grandfather. Now when you hear the history of, for example, the grandfather of Ammar ibn Yasir, what you learn from this is that, number one, he didn't want to bury his daughters, but he had to. Why? Because of the peer pressure in society. The peer pressure in society dictated that if you had a daughter, this was bad news for you. So when you find, for example, the ayah of the Holy Quran, it comes forward, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَإِذَا بُشِّرَ أَحَدُهُمْ بِالْعُنْثَى. And when glad tidings is given to the person that he has had a female daughter, he now has a daughter, what happens? ظَلَّ وَجْهُهُ مسود وهو كظيم. His face changes, it darkens. And it darkens in such a way that he becomes angry with himself. ويتوارى. Yes, ويتوارى من القوم. And they start thinking to themselves, should I go into the streets and tell my people that I've just had a daughter? Or should I go and bury her alive secretly so that no one knows that I had a daughter? Because of peer pressure, this pushed the individual to bury the particular daughters. So you find that there were certain Arabs in Arabia who did not intend to bury their daughters, but rather found it a necessity because of what people will say in the community. This was the second reason. The third reason as to why the Arabs used to bury their daughters alive is because of the reason, and this reason exists even today, because of the fear of poverty. Sometimes the fear of poverty is so powerful and so profound, it makes the human being do or commit the most vile of actions. The fear of poverty is legit, it's a true, authentic fear. If you look at, for example, the story of Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, there's a beautiful hadith of the Holy Prophet. They say that Nabi Ibrahim, he was tried with different imtihanat. He had to confront his uncle who was dear to him, part of Silat al-Rahab. His uncle was an idol worshipper, wazir of Nimrud. Amongst his imtihanat, for example, he had to confront his nation. Amongst his imtihanat was that he was isolated and he was thrown in the fire. Amongst the imtihanat, he had to perform hijrah and leave his homeland. Amongst his imtihanat, he did not have sons. Amongst his imtihanat was that he had to sacrifice Ismail alayhi salam and leave and abandon his wife and his child in Mecca. These are heavy imtihanat. But then in this particular narration, he says, Ya Allah, you have tried me with so many different tests, but I thank you that you have not tried me in areas of poverty. So poverty is a legit fear for each and every one of you. Many of you are fathers. The fear of poverty, you not being able to provide for your children and your wives, for example. It's a legit fear. It's a profound fear. Many people resort to crime just so that they're able to provide for their families. So you find that the fear of poverty overwhelms the heart. It makes them do, for example, it makes them bury their daughters alive. You find that in the time of Mecca, many of them, you have to try and understand the mentality of the people, the men of Mecca, the fathers of Mecca. If a son is born in your family, what happens? You look after this son for 6-7 years, then the son will come out of the house and it will go and start working. It will earn a wage and start providing for the family. Child labor is not a new phenomenon. Child labor existed even in the time of Jahiliyyah. A child at the age of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 would then start earning and providing for the family. If you had a family of many brothers, for example, this would be enough to look after the needs of the family. You know what's interesting is that today you have this whole phenomenon of child labor. Child labor, for example, it's abhorred by people in society. Yet you find the biggest industries in technology, in electronics, even in the fashion industry, they are all guilty of child labor, each and every one of them. The reason, I say to you, wallah, from the deepest depths of my heart, the reason why these abhorred acts exist even today, 1400 years later, after moving on from the age of Jahiliyyah, is because Khilafat was taken away from Ali Muhammad. This is the reason why. I have no shadow of a doubt that if Khilafah was given to Ali Muhammad, you would see justice. You would see no oppression in this world. You will not see poverty based on oppression and injustice in this world. And so, for example, if you had a son was seen as an asset for you and your family. Whereas if a daughter was born in your family, your daughter would live on with you for, say, about 8, 9 years, 10 years, and then she would get married off to a different family. A man would come, marry your daughter, and she would no longer be your responsibility. If your daughter, for example, doesn't marry at that particular age, then she becomes a burden on you. Financial burden. You have to look after her. If you have multiple daughters, for example, this puts a strain on you. So what do? In order to deter that from happening, you're more than willing to take your daughter and bury her alive. Do you know the silliest thing of this particular framework or thought process is that the Arabs of Arabia were looking 10 years into the future. Which sane human being plans 10 years into the future? As in, if you, for example, prepare yourself 6 months later, if you try and prepare your lives in the next stages of your life, 6 months down the line, a year down the line, 2 years maybe, I'll move on to, for example, a different field in occupation. I'll have, for example, this type of a house. I'll buy this type of a car. It makes sense. If you prepare yourself and your lives and the next stages of your life, 6 months to maybe 2 years, maybe 2 years. But 10 years down the line, طول العمل. Yes, Islam says طول العمل is recognized as a sin. Don't try and plan your life 10 years down the line. Who knows, tomorrow you won't even be able to wake up from your bed. To try and prepare your lives 10 years down the line, it doesn't make sense. Live in the moment. Worry about the future later. Why are you worried about something that's not in your hands or not in your control? So the Arabs of Arabia, they would look 10, 12 years down the line and say, because of the fear of poverty that will enter our lives, it is better that we bury this daughter alive. And so these daughters were buried alive because of the fear of poverty. And that's why you read the books of history. You had influences. You had, for example, personalities like Waraka ibn Nawfal. Waraka ibn Nawfal, the uncle, the cousin of Khadija, salamullahi alayha, he would go into the streets of Mecca. He would try and find out families who have given birth to daughters. When he would come towards these families, he would say to them, by God, do not bury your daughters alive. If you are worried about poverty, I will take on that responsibility. I will sponsor your daughters. I will sponsor them. I'll look after them. Whatever you need, name it, I'll give it to you. I'll give you money. But for God's sake, do not bury your daughters alive. He was a Hanif. He was a believer in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But these were his actions. They say, historians explain that he would work, he would earn a living, he would look after his family. Whatever extra he had remaining, he would use that to support the different families in Mecca. He would support the families who are not able to financially support themselves. What do we do when we have extra from our income? We plan to go, for example, to Mauritius. We go to Istanbul. Yes, we're thinking about what to buy next, what house to look for, where to go for a holiday. I say to you, look at the biography of Waraka ibn Nawfal. You look at the biographies of the A'imma alayhim as-salam. Whatever extra they had from their income, they would give it away towards the fuqara and the masakin. They would try and close the gap that existed between the rich and the poor. But everything in its own place. So Waraka ibn Nawfal used to support the orphans, used to support the female infants in society. Then you had Khadijat al-Kubra. Khadijat al-Kubra, she was known to be Sayyidat al-Nisa amongst the Quraysh. Her doors were always open for those who needed help. In the middle of the night, for example, you had women running into her home. Ya Khadija, I've just given birth to a daughter. My husband doesn't know that I've given birth to a daughter. Khadija would say, your daughter is now under my protection. Whatever you need, I will look after her. If your husband dares to touch this daughter of yours, he will have to answer to me. She had that power and she utilized that power to look after the daughters of Mecca, to look after the daughters of Hijaz. She was seen as the mother of the aitam, the mother of the orphans many a times. Yes, they sought her help and she helped each and every one of them. That's why in her testimony, in her wasiyah to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, she would say, Ya Rasulullah, I have one wish for you. Amongst the three wishes that she leaves behind for the Holy Prophet, she says, one of my wishes, Ya Rasulullah, is look after the aitam of Hijaz. They used to come to me, they used to seek help from me. There would be no one to help them except for me. Ya Rasulullah, keep this sunnah alive, look after them. So, the fear of poverty was something that induced the fathers to bury their daughters alive. The fear of poverty, what's interesting is that when you approach the Quran says, الشَّيْطَانُ يَعِدُكُمُ الْفَقْرِ. Shaitan threatens you with poverty. When it comes to sadaqah, when it comes to khums, when it comes to giving of zakat, it's heavy on our hearts. Why? Because it makes us think subconsciously, for some of us actively and consciously, that when I give 20% of my wealth, faqr will come into my life. I will become or I will be a victim of poverty. These are all waswas of shaitan. Give from your wealth and give as much as you want, because Allah is the one who will protect you. In the ayah of the Holy Quran, as a message to the people of Arabia, Allah says, do not bury your daughters alive. Allah is the one who sustains. If you're worried about your wealth, Allah is the one who controls your wealth. Allah can give it to you, Allah can take it away from you. If you are burying your daughters alive because of the fear of poverty, understand that Allah will look after you and Allah will provide for them and will provide for you also. You know, many a times, let's be real with this discussion, many a times you have, for example, young couples, married for many, many years. You ask them, do you have any plans for children? They say, no, we don't have plans for children. Why? Because we're not financially stable to have children. You have, for example, a couple, they decide to have children, they plan for a family, and they have children. May Allah bless them. But then sometimes you have a couple, for example, they don't plan for a family, but then according to them, accidents happen. Accidents never happen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the viewpoint of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has blessed them with an infant. Allah has blessed them with children. But then when they are blessed with children, you find that the husband, many a times, he is clouded by this particular thought. How am I going to afford this? We'll need to look for a new car, a new house. We'll need to change the way we live. Yes, I won't be able to, for example, buy the things that I want to buy. All of a sudden, the thought of being a victim of poverty enters his mind. It's legit. It's a true concept to think about. It's a fear that's natural. But Allah steps in the eye of the Holy Quran and says, don't worry, I will look after you and I will look after your daughters and your sons as well. Plan on having a family. If you're worried about your financial status, I say to you, there are many people that have come before us. And many of our elders in our communities, they had children when they were very young. They were married when they were very young. And today, my God, they are some of the most successful individuals in our communities financially. Allah looks after you. Allah looks after you and your children if it is done with ikhlas and niyyah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The idea of female infanticide, you realize that it's not something that was common during the age of Jahiliyyah. But there were other areas in the world where this tradition was quite rampant. It was quite famous. For example, you look towards India. In ancient Hinduism, the idea of killing the infant was very much prevalent. Even today, because of the dowry system in India, in the villages, female daughters are killed and they are disregarded. They are not even considered to be human beings. When you look towards China, for example, the practice of killing infant daughters has been rampant for the past 2,000 years. Today, because of the one-child policy, yes, it is still active in the streets of China. If you were to have a child, you make sure that it's a boy. If it's a girl, then you have the option of, for example, keeping her, or you have the option of abortion, or you have, for example, the option of killing her when she's born, or you have the option of selling her off. In Pakistan as well, you find, for example, this tradition is quite rampant. When you have an adulteress who, for example, gives birth to a baby girl, she disregards this baby girl, throws her in the trash. We've heard this before in the news. Many a times we see articles here and there of how female daughters were found, for example, in the trash, how they were found drowned in the rivers. In England as well, it's quite rampant in our societies. Don't think that this happens, all of this happens outside of the UK. Just recent articles in 2019, what does it say? It says that there are certain hospitals within the UK, there are certain clinics in the UK that will not release the gender of the fetus when the mother comes for the scan, out of fear that the father will do something silly. And so this particular information is kept hidden from that particular family. And so sometimes you have to realize that Islam talks about a particular movement of how abhorred it was. Islam came with a solution. 1400 years later, you find that there are certain communities in the world that are going through the same problems. History, wallah, history repeats itself. Let's come to the second area of the discussion. The second area of the discussion, what effect does this have in society? When you have a society that is built up on you making you think that women or females have no rights whatsoever to live, it destroys the whole demographics of society. You go back to the history of Jahiliyyah. You can approach this discussion from a number of different perspectives. You can look at it from an economical perspective, a political perspective. But what the perspective I want to talk about is through marriage and how it affected Jahiliyyah Arabs in terms of marriage. Marriage is the joining of families. Marriage is the union of families. Marriage is what strengthens societies or it breaks society. Islam focuses on marriage because it is a gateway in strengthening communities. When communities are strengthened, it strengthens society as a whole. That's why I remember one of our ulama in Qom mentioned beautiful words. He says, 50 years from today, you will find there is no respect for families. This whole institution of the media, it is aimed to destroy families. If families are destroyed, communities and societies will destroy itself. That's why the religion of Islam focuses heavily on the sanctity of a family. Khub. Look at marriage, for example, in the time of Jahiliyyah. There were a few types of marriages that existed in the time of Jahiliyyah. And understand how women were objectified rather than seen as human beings. You had, for example, Zawaj al-Shighar. Zawaj al-Shighar is what? A man comes to his friend, he says, I want to marry your daughter or your sister, but I will not give you any mahar. But instead, you can marry my daughter or my sister in return. Zawaj al-Shighar, what did it say? I'll marry your daughter or your sister in return that you marry my daughter and my sister. This was the first type of marriage. Then you had Zawaj al-Asr, that when one tribe attacks another tribe, yes, we spoke about this. When one tribe attacks another tribe, the women and the children are taken as captives. Then these women are married off. They become the property of the soldiers. They can do whatever they want because these women are seen as slaves. If, for example, the soldier wants to marry her, he can marry her and he can marry as many as he wants. If he wants to sell her off, he can sell her off. Then you have, for example, the type of marriage which did not exist between tribes. So, for example, if one person wanted to marry a woman from a different tribe, that woman had no rights whatsoever. She did not have rights in terms of the identity of the children, meaning that if the children were always part of the father's tribe and never of the mother's tribe. But if, for example, the woman married the man and they were both from the same tribe, then alhamdulillah, she has some rights at least. Then you have, for example, the marriage of inheritance. That if the father passes away, then the son inherits all of the mothers, all of his stepmothers. All of the wives of his father, they are inherited by the son. If he wants to keep them, he can keep them. If he wants to sell them, he can sell them. This was the type of marriage that existed in the time of Jahiliyyah. Rasulullah comes forward with the message of the Quran and he makes each and every one of them batil, one by one. This type of marriage has no place within the religion of Islam. Slowly a revolution was taking place within the city of Mecca, within the city of Medina. A tradition that had existed and was engraved within the people and in their hearts, Rasulullah was now undoing every single act which was seen as abhorrent by the religion of Islam. To the extent that Rasulullah was given a daughter. لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. Allah says, look towards the Holy Prophet of Islam, look at his character, look at his akhlaq. He was given a daughter and how he respected his daughter. Whenever, for example, she would come into the room, he would stand for her. He would come, he would kiss her hands, he would embrace her, he would speak highly of her, he would give some of his time for Fatima al-Zahra, Sayyidat al-Nisa al-Alameen. You find that the Holy Prophet of Islam gave respect to Fatima in such a way that it built her identity, it built her character. They ask, what do you learn from Rasulullah 1,400 years later? I, as an individual, as a father, I learn how to be a father by looking at the life of Rasulullah. And I say to you, my dear fathers, pay attention to your daughters. Try and spend time with them as much as possible. Speak with them. Take them out for brunch. Take them out for dinner. Take them out and do something with them. Show them that you are invested in their lives. Give them your time. Yes, speak with them. Interact with them. Do not cut them off from your lives. Do not see them for 1 or 2 hours a day and that's it. Be invested in their lives. You find, for example, build their self-esteem, build their confidence. Give them the attention that they want and that they seek from you. Because if you do not give them this, they will go outside of the house and get it from someone else. They will get it from strangers online. They will go to their schools and colleges and universities and seek attention from other men. But if the father gives attention to his daughter, it stabilizes, it gives her that stability in her life. It strengthens her character. What happened in the courts of the Khulafa? When Fatima al-Zahra gave the sermon of Fadak, all of that was because of Rasulullah and how he molded her character and identity. And so you find that the Madhlumiyya of Fatima was just as significant as the Madhlumiyya of the Banat of Hashim, the daughters of Al-Hashimiyya. We cannot say that the Madhlumiyya, that the dhulm that fell on Fatima was less than the dhulm of Zainab and Kulthum. So you find that the daughter of Rasulullah, she was an embodiment. She was a manifestation of how a true daughter ought to be treated within society, within the religion of Islam. Then you come towards the daughters of Ali alayhi salam. And look how each of their daughters were now part and parcel of Karbala. Fatima wasn't there, but her actions made sure that she was there. Her actions, what happened in the courts of the Khulafa, all of that transpired on the day of Karbala. You find the daughters of Imam Ali alayhi salam, Zainab and Kulthum. They were there in Karbala. It was their words and their message that carried the profundity of what happened on the day of Ashura. You find, for example, the daughter of Imam al-Hassan was also present in Karbala. The daughter of Imam al-Hassan was Fatima. Who was Fatima? Fatima, the wife of Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, the mother of Imam al-Baqir, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhim. Then, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Then you have the daughters of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. The first daughter was Fatima al-Kubra. Fatima al-Kubra, she remained in Medina. She was ill, she was sick. She could not accompany the camps towards the city of Karbala. But they say that before Abu Abdullah alayhi salam leaves Medina, they say Fatima al-Kubra comes running towards her father, Baba, allow me to see my young brother Ali al-Asghar one final time. They say she embraces Ali al-Asghar. Then the camps they leave and they proceed towards Medina. Towards Mecca. This was Fatima al-Kubra. Then you had the second daughter of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, Fatima al-Sughra. Fatima al-Sughra is home. They say Fatima al-Sughra is the daughter of Ishaq. Ishaq was the wife of Imam al-Hassan. When Imam al-Hassan passed away, when he became a shaheed, in his wasiyah he tells his brother Imam al-Husayn, marry my wife Ishaq. Ishaq, he marries Ishaq, and from that wife he has Fatima al-Sughra. I say to you, read the Maqatil. Fatima al-Sughra delivers a fiery sermon in the streets of Kufa. Alongside Zainab and alongside Kulthum, there is the sermon of Fatima al-Sughra. She comes forward and she says, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله وأشهد أن أولاده ذبحوا بشت فرات من غير ذحل ومن غير ترات. He says, I bear witness that the sons of Muhammad was slaughtered at Shan and Ghariba alongside the Furat without any excuses, without any reason. And it's a lengthy sermon. Go and read the sermon of Fatima al-Sughra. This was the second daughter of Imam al-Husayn. Then you have the third daughter of Imam al-Husayn, and this is where it gets a bit tricky. The third daughter is Sakina. Sakina, they say she goes on to marry Hassan al-Muthanna. Hassan al-Muthanna is the son of Imam al-Hassan. Hassan, the son of Imam al-Hassan, he fought in Karbala, but he survives. He returns to the city of Medina and he marries Sakina, and they live on for many decades. Then the fourth daughter of Imam al-Husayn, goes by the name of Ruqayya, but we know her as Sakina, the youngest daughter of Abi Abdullah. They say that one day when Abu Hamza al-Thumali came towards Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, come. He says, Yabna Rasulullah, why do you cry? Allah has made oppression part of your destinies. Why do you cry? He says, Ya Aba Hamza, Shakar Allahu sa'yaka ya Aba Hamza, walakinni wallahi ma nadhartu ila ammati wa akhawati illa wa dhakartu firarahunna yawma ashura. He says, Ya Aba Hamza, whenever I look towards my aunts and my sisters, I remind myself of how they would run on the day of Ashura. Min khaymatin ila khayma, min khuba'in ila khuba, from one tent to another, running away from the fires of the enemy. وينادي المنادي احرقوا بيوت الظالمين, whilst the enemies would call out, burn the tents of Al Muhammad. Hamid ibn Muslim then narrates, he says, when I saw the tents burning on the day of Ashura, I saw a young girl running from one tent to another. Then I saw her wandering in the sands of Karbala. I came towards her and I said, Ya Sakina, where are you going? Tell me, I can take you wherever you need to go. Sakina turns to me, she says, Ya Sheikh, tell me, are you with us or against us? He says, Ya Sakina, I am neither with you nor against you. Tell me, where are you going? I'll take you there. Sakina says, Ya Sheikh, take me to the lands of Najaf. He says, Ya Sakina, why Najaf? What's in Najaf? She says, I heard my aunt Zainab say to me, Ya Sakina, there is a man who is buried in the lands of Najaf. This man is known as Mushkil Kusha. If you are in difficulties, go towards the lands of Najaf and you will see help emanate from this grave. Ya Sheikh, take me to the lands of Najaf. I want to go see this man and tell him of my troubles and my anguish so that I can see some help come from him. Hamid replies, Ya Sakina, but Najaf is very far. I cannot take you to the lands of Najaf. Sakina says, Ya Hamid, then take me towards the river. Take me towards the Furat. He says, I can do that for you. He then takes Sakina towards the Furat. When Sakina comes towards the Furat, what does she see? She sees her uncle Abu Fadl al-Abbas. She comes towards the body of her uncle. She throws herself on her uncle. Ya Ammi Abbas, rise and stand. Protect us. Rise and stand, protect us, my uncle Abbas. Things have gotten bad after you've left us. This was Sakina. Now bring your hearts towards Sham. Bring your hearts towards the prisons of Sham. One night, Sakina wakes up from her sleep. She's crying and wailing and mourning. Baba, ya Ammati Zainab, I want to see my father. Ya Zainab, I want to see my father. Zainab responds, Ya Sakina, your father has gone on a long trip. Have sabr, one day you will get to see him. They say that because of the wailing and crying, Yazid wakes up from his sleep. He cries out, he says, who is this woman crying? They say to him, it's Ruqayya, it's Sakina. She's crying and wailing. What does she want? She wants to see her father. Then what are you waiting for? Go and give her father. Let her see her father. The guards, they came with a plate and a lid on top of this plate. They came and they gave it to Sakina. Sakina turns to her aunt. My aunt Zainab, I did not ask for food. I want to see my father, Abi Abdullah. They say that Sakina tells Zainab tells Sakina, Ya Sakina, remove the lid. She removes the lid. She sees the head of her father, Abi Abdullah. She grabs onto the head of her father. She embraces the head. She begins to caress the hair. She begins to kiss his face. Then all of a sudden there is no sound coming from Sakina. And this night there was silence. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam then turns to Zainab. He says to her, Ya Ammati Zainab, go and take the head of my father from my sister Sakina. Go and place a cloth on my body, on her body. Zainab replies, she says, Yabna Rasulullah, what's happened? He says to her, Ya Ammati Ya Zainab, Sakina is no longer with us. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. If we can recite Surah Al-Fatiha for all our marhumin, inshallah. Surah Al-Mubarakat Al-Fatiha تسبق مع الصلاة مع الصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. صل على louder إن شاء الله. اللهم صل على محمد.